It started with a voice sharper than the morning air, a voice that cut across the stillness of the lake like a knife. "You can't be here. This dock is under HOA regulation." And when I turned from where I was securing the rope of my fishing skiff to the post, I saw her. Karen, the self-appointed queen of our lakeside community, striding toward me with a clipboard clutched to her chest, and a look of righteous fury etched across her heavily powdered face. And though the sun had barely lifted over the tree line, painting the glassy surface of the water with streaks of gold, she was already in full battle mode. Her designer sandals slapping against the wood as she marched, her oversized sunglasses perched like armor, her lips pursed as though every word she was about to unleash carried the weight of law. And for a moment, I just stared, half in disbelief, and half in amusement, because here I was on my own dock, built by my grandfather decades ago, maintained by my hands every spring, and this woman who had moved in less than a year ago thought she had the authority to tell me where I could and couldn't stand. And I'll admit, I let the silence stretch, let the sound of the lapping water and the creak of the wood fill the gap, because I wanted her to hear the absurdity of her own claim echoing back at her. But Karen never faltered. No, she thrived in silence, mistaking it for submission. And with a dramatic flourish, she tapped her clipboard and announced, "As of this morning, the HOA has passed a new ordinance regarding personal docks. No unauthorized use, no personal modifications, and absolutely no mooring of vessels unless approved by the board." And the way she emphasized board, you'd think she was talking about the Supreme Court. Not a handful of nosy neighbors drunk on the idea of power. And that was when I realized she wasn't bluffing, that she had woken up early, rallied her cronies, and rushed through some ridiculous motion to target me specifically, because for months she had been circling like a hawk, criticizing my dock, my boat, even the way I stacked my firewood, as though my family's legacy on this lake was a stain on her vision of some Stepford-perfect shoreline community. But what she didn't realize, what she could never realize, was that my claim to this land and water ran deeper than her paper ordinances, deeper than her rules scribbled in ink, deeper even than the pilings that held this dock in place, because my grandfather had not only built it, he had registered the shoreline rights legally with the county, and those rights had been passed down to me like the deed to the very soul of this lake. And as Karen launched into a speech about fines, penalties, and enforcement measures, her words echoing across the water to the ears of curious neighbors who had paused their morning routines to watch from their porches, I felt that slow burn ignite in my chest. That mixture of anger and defiance that comes when someone tries to erase your history with the stroke of a pen. And though I could have argued, though I could have shown her the papers right then and there, I chose silence again. Not submission, but calculation. Because in that pause, in that measured stillness, I saw the boat behind her. Her prized luxury speedboat, gleaming white with chrome trim, tethered neatly to the communal dock that, unbeknownst to her, fell within the boundary lines of my registered water rights. And in that instant, the decision crystallized like ice on the lake in winter. If she wanted to play queen, then I would show her what it meant to lose her crown. Not tomorrow, not after weeks of legal wrangling, but today, this hour, while her voice still rang with self-importance, I would make the move that would shift the entire balance of power, and so I let her finish, let her wave her clipboard and point her manicured finger, let her threaten to call the sheriff, and then, with a calmness that must have unnerved her, I simply said, "You want me off this dock? Fine, but then you'd better be ready to move your boat too, because it's sitting in my water." And the way her face froze, the way her sunglasses slipped just slightly down her nose as if her brain couldn't process what she had just heard. That was the crack in her armor I had been waiting for. And before she could recover, before she could summon her haughty laugh or her venomous retort, I walked past her, down the communal dock, and without breaking stride, untied the rope securing her boat, coiling it neatly as though it were my own, and with one powerful push sent the vessel gliding into open water, her gasp sharp and shrill behind me, echoing like the cry of a bird. Of prey suddenly grounded, and as I stepped onto her boat, steadying myself with the ease of a man who had grown up on these waters, I heard her shriek, "That's theft! That's illegal! You can't do that!" But her words were powerless against the fact of motion, against the reality of her prized possession drifting steadily away from the dock under my control, and as I took the wheel, starting the engine. With a roar that shattered the lake's morning calm, I turned just long enough to meet her horrified eyes and said, "If you think you own this water, then take me to court. But until then, your boat is under my custody." And with that, I throttled forward, the bow lifting, spray kicking up in a glorious arc as neighbors gasped and pointed, some laughing outright, others clapping, because for years Karen had ruled with intimidation, had bullied them into compliance, but now, in one bold act, the spell was broken, and as I steered her boat toward the middle of the lake, the sun climbing higher, the water sparkling like 1,000 shards of glass, I felt not just defiance but justice, raw and immediate, because she had come to evict me. And instead, before the hour was up, I had seized the very symbol of her power, and this was only the beginning, the first move in a battle that would stretch beyond docks and boats into courts, communities, and reputations, a battle that would expose secrets Karen had buried deep, and though she screamed from the dock, her voice hoarse, threatening lawsuits and vengeance, I knew in my bones she had already lost the first war. And that realization was sweeter than the summer air, stronger than the lake's current, a promise that the tides had turned and that I would not stop until every last false decree of hers had sunk like a stone to the bottom of these waters. The moment I cut the engine in the middle of the lake, savoring the silence after that thunderous roar, I knew Karen wouldn't take her humiliation quietly. And sure enough, by the time I brought her speedboat around and idled it just far enough, from the communal dock to keep it out of her reach, she was already on her phone, pacing like a rabid animal, gesturing wildly as she screamed into the receiver. No doubt calling the sheriff, the HOA board, maybe even a lawyer. But what she didn't realize was that every second she spent flailing only deepened the cracks in her authority, because neighbors were no longer averting their eyes. They were watching openly now, some filming with their phones, others chuckling, as if they'd been waiting years for someone to finally stand up to her, and I knew this spectacle was the beginning of a shift, the unraveling of her carefully cultivated image of control. But I also knew Karen's venom ran deep, that she would marshal every resource at her disposal to strike back, and I wasn't wrong, because less than an hour later, just as I had, tethered her boat to my own dock with deliberate neatness, 2 county sheriff's vehicles came crunching down the gravel road that led to the cabins, lights flashing in the early sun, and Karen, who had stationed herself at the entrance like a queen awaiting her cavalry, waved them in with manic triumph, shouting, "There he is! That's the man who stole my property! Arrest him!" And though the deputies stepped out with hands resting casually on their belts, their eyes already told me they weren't buying the drama wholesale, because they had seen Karen before, had dealt with her countless nuisance complaints, and won. Even rolled his eyes subtly as she launched into her tirade, jabbing her finger at me, but this time she had her trump card, or so she thought, because she shoved her clipboard into their hands, papers clipped neatly, and crowed, "The HOA passed an ordinance this morning. His dock is unauthorized, and he illegally commandeered my boat." And for a moment, I let the silence linger, watching the deputies exchange glances, then leaf through the papers, the younger one muttering, "This looks more like a homeowner's guideline than law." But Karen was relentless, screeching, "It's binding. It's enforceable. He has no right to be here." And that was when I moved, not with bluster, but with precision, because I had anticipated this escalation, had prepared for it months ago when Karen first began circling like a vulture, and so I reached into my satchel and pulled out the folded, time-worn documents that bore my grandfather's name, the original shoreline registration, the county deed, the legal survey stamped and notarized decades ago. and when I placed them on the hood of the sheriff's cruiser, the sun catching the embossed seal, the atmosphere shifted, because suddenly it wasn't Karen's shrill voice that commanded the scene. It was the weight of ink, paper, and history. And as the older deputy read, his brow furrowing deeper with each line, Karen's smug grin faltered, her lips twitching as though she might interrupt. But even she could sense the tide turning, and when the deputy finally looked up and said, "Ma'am, according to this, he owns not just the dock, but the riparian rights extending 50 feet into the water, including where your boat is moored," the color drained from her face like water from a sieve, and for the first time, I saw true panic flicker in her eyes. But of course she wasn't done, not Karen, never Karen, because she drew herself up, slapped her sunglasses back into place, and hissed, "Then I'll take this to court. I'll take him for everything he has." And with that, she spun, storming back toward her cabin, her sandals snapping against the gravel, already dialing her phone again, no doubt summoning her lawyer, maybe even the full HOA board. But what she didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that in her desperation she was about to open doors best left shut. Because my family's legacy wasn't just about deeds and rights, it was about knowledge, about records of land transfers and backroom deals the HOA had relied on for years. Records I had quietly gathered, and if Karen wanted a war in court, she was going to get one. But it wouldn't end the way she imagined. It would end with her empire crumbling, her allies scattering, and her secrets dragged into the light, secrets she had guarded with every ounce of her scheming energy, secrets that, once exposed, would make the boat she lost that morning look like a trinket compared to the empire she was about to forfeit. And so I stood there, watching the dust of her retreat rise into the air, the deputies shrugging as if to say they wanted no part of this mess. And I felt that slow burn of anticipation again, because Karen thought she had just escalated the battle. But in reality, she had just walked onto the battlefield I had been preparing for all along. A battlefield where her weapons of gossip, intimidation, and ordinances were useless, where only truth and law carried weight. And the truth was, the dock she tried to steal from me was nothing compared to the empire of fraud I was about to seize from her. When the summons finally arrived 2 weeks later, delivered not by a uniformed deputy, but by a weary courier who muttered, "Good luck," under his breath as he handed me the thick envelope, I knew Karen had gone all in. And as I slit the paper, with a steady hand at my cabin table, staring out at the lake that shimmered with an almost mocking calm, I saw that she had indeed filed a civil suit in county court, the language dripping with venom, accusing me of theft, trespass, unlawful, seizure of property, and violations of HOA ordinances. But what made me laugh, an actual laugh that startled even me, was the sheer arrogance of it. Because nestled among the accusations was a demand for damages totaling nearly $250,000, as though Karen thought she could crush me not just with paper and gavel, but with financial ruin, and yet what she had done, without realizing it, was drag into the open, a fight that could no longer be twisted in backroom meetings or manipulated through whispered threats, because now it would play out under the harsh fluorescent lights of a courtroom, with a judge, a record, and witnesses sworn to truth. And that was a terrain where Karen's theatrics lost their potency. So I prepared, not with bluster but with precision, gathering every deed, every survey, every photograph and affidavit from neighbors who had suffered under her reign. And when the day came, the courtroom was packed, the wooden benches creaking under the weight of curious locals, HOA loyalists, and neighbors who had long prayed for her downfall. And there at the plaintiff's table sat Karen, dressed like she, was attending a gala, dripping with jewelry, her lawyer beside her flipping through notes with a smug grin, and across from them. I sat alone at first, my stack of evidence neatly arranged, calm in my posture but burning inside with the knowledge of what was about to unfold, and when the judge entered, a stern woman with steel-gray hair and a gaze that could cut granite, silence fell, and Karen rose dramatically, launching into A monologue about property rights, unauthorized docks, and the trauma of having her boat stolen by a rogue homeowner, her voice rising with every phrase until the judge raised a single hand and said, "Ms. Whitfield, this is not theater. Stick to the facts." And for a moment, Karen faltered, her mouth snapping shut like a trap denied its prey. But she quickly recovered, waving her papers as her lawyer took over, citing HOA bylaws as though they carried the force of federal law. But then it was my turn, and when I rose, the hush was different. It was expectant, like the air before a storm, and I placed the original county deed on the evidence table, the embossed seal glinting, and said clearly, "This property, this dock, and the rights extending into the water have been mine since my grandfather registered them in 1963. The HOA has no jurisdiction here." Gasps rippled through the benches, neighbors leaning forward, and the judge leaned in, adjusting her glasses as she read, then glanced at Karen's lawyer and asked, "Counsel, are you suggesting your HOA bylaws supersede county property law?" And for the first time, a flicker of unease crossed his smug features. But before he could fumble an answer, I laid down the next card. Photographs, timestamps, and video of Karen harassing neighbors, cutting locks, issuing fines for imaginary violations, and even, most damningly, minutes from an HOA board meeting I had obtained, leaked by a disillusioned board member, that revealed Karen scheming to inflate dues, pocket funds, and target homeowners who resisted. And, as the judge's eyes scanned those transcripts, her jaw tightened, and Karen, sensing the shift, began to fidget, whispering furiously to her lawyer, her face flushing crimson. But the real hammer dropped when I introduced the testimony of an elderly neighbor, Mr. Hawkins, who shuffled to the stand with the help of a cane, raised his hand, and swore to tell the truth, his voice trembling at first but gaining strength as he recounted how Karen had bullied him, fined him thousands over a supposed unauthorized fence, and threatened to seize his property if he didn't comply, and as his words echoed through the chamber, the judge's patience visibly thinned and murmurs spread through the gallery, the collective weight of years of resentment surfacing at once. And then came the twist Karen hadn't prepared for, because as the cross-examination faltered and her lawyer stammered, a county clerk entered with a manila folder, documents I had requested through a Public Records Act filing weeks earlier, and those documents revealed something no one in that room expected. Karen's own property. Her vaunted lakeside mansion sat partially on land never properly deeded to her, land that still legally belonged to the county. And when I laid that evidence before the court, the silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of Karen gasping, her hand flying to her mouth, and the judge, now visibly bristling, declared, "We will recess while I review these materials," her gavel striking with the force of a thunderclap, and as people poured into the hall buzzing with shock, Karen sat frozen, her empire visibly cracking, her lawyer pale and sweating, while I simply returned to my bench, hands folded, the calm eye of the storm, knowing that the war was far from over, but the tide had irrevocably shifted, and Karen, for the first time in her reign of terror, wasn't dictating the narrative. She was drowning in it. The courthouse steps that afternoon looked like the stage of a play Karen hadn't rehearsed for, because while she had once reveled in standing before neighbors with a smirk and a clipboard, now she was hunched, sunglasses hiding her bloodshot eyes whispering furiously into her phone as cameras flashed, because the media had caught wind of the spectacle, reporters shoving microphones toward her, shouting questions about embezzled HOA funds and improper land titles, and though she barked no comment, repeatedly her voice cracked, betraying the panic seething just beneath her designer facade. But even as she slithered into her black SUV and slammed the door, I knew she wasn't finished. Karen was a fighter, but more than that, she was a cornered animal now, and cornered animals lash out. So when I returned to my cabin that evening, the lake shimmering orange with sunset, It didn't surprise me to find an anonymous notice tacked to my dock post, warning me to vacate within 72 hours or face dire consequences, the words typed. But the menace familiar. And when I tore it down and tossed it into the fire, I resolved that if Karen wanted escalation, I'd be ready, but even I wasn't prepared for how far she would go. Because the very next morning, county inspectors rolled up unannounced in 3 vehicles, clipboards in hand, claiming they had received complaints of zoning violations, unsafe structures, and environmental hazards. But the way they glanced uneasily at one another, the way their words faltered, told me they weren't there on their own accord. Someone had pushed them, someone with clout, and of course I knew who, but rather than argue, I welcomed them in, offered coffee on the porch, and let them wander, because I had nothing to hide. And by the time they left, scratching their heads at the baseless complaints, their tone had shifted, one even muttering, "She's trying too hard, this won't stick." And that's when it clicked. Karen wasn't fighting for property anymore, she was fighting for survival, because the cracks in her empire weren't just legal. They were personal, financial, and reputational. And when people like her sense collapse, they double down with desperation. So I wasn't shocked when the following week, a state investigator from the Attorney General's office arrived at my dock, badge flashing in the sunlight, asking for a private conversation, and as we sat facing the water, he explained they had been quietly investigating HOA corruption across several counties, Karen's name surfacing again and again in complaints, and now, thanks to the courtroom documents I'd unveiled, they had the leverage they needed to expand their probe, and he asked if I would cooperate, to which I simply smiled and handed him a flash drive containing months of Karen's threats, HOA meeting recordings, and financial ledgers leaked by that same disillusioned board member, and when he left, his handshake firm, his eyes gleaming with resolve, I realized Karen had finally attracted the kind of attention she couldn't control with gossip or intimidation. She was on the radar of forces far beyond our lake, and though she would fight like hell to wriggle free, she was tangled now in nets she hadn't even seen being cast. But still, she wasn't done trying, and her next move proved just how far she'd fallen, because 2 nights later, under a moonless sky, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching gravel outside my cabin, hushed voices whispering, and when I peered through the curtain, I caught sight of 3 men, strangers, moving with the nervous energy of hired muscle, their attention fixed on my dock where Karen's former boat bobbed, chained securely to my piling, and I watched as one produced bolt cutters, glinting faintly in the dark, but before they could strike, the floodlight I had installed roared to life, blinding them in a searing wash of white, and I stepped out onto the porch with a shotgun resting casually in my arms, my voice calm but carrying across the water as I said, "Gentlemen, you're trespassing. Sheriff's Department is 10 minutes away. Care to wait with me?" And the panic on their faces was instant, the cutters clattering to the ground as they scrambled back up the path, disappearing into the night. And though I didn't chase, I knew exactly who had sent them. Because Karen's fingerprints were all over cowardly maneuvers like that, yet what she hadn't realized was that her enemies weren't just me anymore. The neighbors, once cowed by her reign, were emboldened now, and in the following days more and more came to me sharing stories of extortion, fines, and threats, bringing copies of letters, bank statements, even audio recordings of Karen berating them at board meetings. And it became clear that the HOA wasn't just a nuisance, it was a racket. And Karen wasn't just a bully, she was the linchpin of a corrupt operation siphoning money under the guise of community improvement. And as the state's investigation widened, subpoenas landing like thunderclaps across the neighborhood, the HOA board began to fracture, members resigning in a flurry of panic, one even holding a press conference where he tearfully confessed to being coerced by Karen, describing her as ruthless, manipulative, and willing to ruin lives to get her way. And with each defection, her fortress crumbled further, yet still she fought, filing appeals, summoning lawyers, even hiring PR consultants who staged laughable photo ops of her donating to charities. But the tide was unstoppable now. Because once the press latched onto the narrative of HOA Queen Pin Understate Probe, there was no burying it, and the woman who once strutted through the neighborhood wielding fines like weapons now cowered behind drawn curtains, her phone ringing off the hook with demands she couldn't meet, her empire bleeding from every wound. And yet, I knew one thing. Karen wouldn't simply surrender. She'd scheme until the bitter end. And that meant the final act was still to come. The act where desperation would drive her into mistakes too big to recover from. Mistakes that would not only end her reign, but strip her of everything she valued. Down to the very lakefront she had tried to seize from me, and as I sat on my dock watching the sun sink behind the trees, Karen's former boat rocking gently in the golden light, I felt the inevitability of it. The end was near, and when it came, it wouldn't be quiet, it would be spectacular. By the time autumn rolled in and the lake shifted from its glassy summer shimmer to a darker, wind-churned surface, Karen had become a ghost in her own neighborhood. Blinds drawn, car rarely moving from the drive, the HOA office shuttered except for the occasional desperate meeting she called in secret, though fewer and fewer board members bothered to attend, and those who did only came to protect themselves. But I knew she wasn't finished because people like Karen never stop scheming until every ounce of power is wrung from their grip. And sure enough, one gray morning, I woke to the sound of commotion near the marina. Walked down to find news crews gathered, cameras pointed at Karen as she stood defiantly before microphones, announcing that she was filing a countersuit against me, against the neighbors, against even the county itself, declaring that she was the victim of a witch hunt, that I was a dangerous squatter who had manipulated the courts, and for a moment, it almost looked convincing. The makeup, the designer jacket, the trembling voice. But then, the crowd erupted with boos, neighbors, shouting "liar" and "thief," and the mask slipped, her face twisting in rage as she screamed back, and the footage that aired that night across local and then national stations was damning, the image of an HOA president unraveling in public, and what followed was the death knell. Because once national reporters dug in, they uncovered layers even I hadn't anticipated. Shell accounts funneling HOA dues into her personal businesses, fraudulent permits signed under her name, and, most shocking, evidence that she had leveraged political donations to skirt zoning violations for her own mansion, the very mansion already under scrutiny for being built on improperly deeded land, and within weeks, subpoenas turned to indictments, and the woman who once bragged that "nothing happens here without my say" was now facing criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. But true to form, Karen tried one last gambit, hiring a high-priced defense attorney, who promised to crush these baseless charges, and for months the trial loomed, the town buzzing with anticipation, the lake community tense with the knowledge that the outcome would decide more than her fate. It would decide whether years of abuse by HOA tyrants everywhere could finally be checked, and when the trial began, the courtroom was even fuller than before, cameras lining the aisles, and Karen, though thinner and paler, still carried herself with arrogance, as though she believed one dazzling performance might redeem her. But this wasn't a stage she could control, because witness after witness took the stand, neighbors recounting threats, auditors presenting, forged ledgers, even former allies testifying about being coerced into silence, and though her lawyer cross-examined with slick precision, the sheer weight of the evidence crushed every argument. And when I was called, when I laid before the jury the original deeds, the recordings, the photos, and the story of how she tried to evict me only to watch me seize her boat in full view of the community, the jury's expressions hardened. And Karen glared at me across the courtroom with a venom that could have felled lesser men. But I held her gaze, calm, unyielding, because I knew this was the end. And sure enough, after 3 grueling weeks of testimony, the jury filed back in, and the foreman's voice rang out with the word that rippled like thunder across the county. "Guilty!" And Karen's gasp sharp and guttural, was drowned out by the roar of whispered relief and satisfaction from the gallery. And when the judge, with steely finality, sentenced her to 10 years in state prison and ordered restitution of nearly $1 million to the HOA's victims, the spell that had held this community hostage for years shattered completely. Neighbors embracing, reporters rushing to file the story, and Karen herself collapsing into her chair, her jewelry rattling as bailiffs closed in. But the tale didn't end there, because within months of her imprisonment, the HOA dissolved entirely, replaced by a cooperative association that actually served the residents. And the funds seized from Karen's accounts went back into repairing docks, roads, and community spaces, while her mansion, seized by the state, was auctioned off to pay debts, the gaudy symbol of her arrogance stripped of its glory. And as for her boat, the one she had lost that very first hour when she tried to evict me, it remained tied to my dock until I sold it at auction, the proceeds funding a scholarship for local kids in her very name. A final, ironic twist that made even the judge chuckle when she heard. But the true satisfaction came not from property or money, but from the sight of neighbors walking freely down paths once patrolled by Karen's watchful eye, children laughing on docks without fear of fines, and the knowledge that one person's defiance had sparked a reckoning, that standing tall on that morning when Karen thought she had won had lit the fuse that burned down her empire. And though I sometimes sit on the dock in the quiet evenings, listening to the lapping water and remembering the chaos, the threats, the courtroom battles, I always come back to that single moment, the hour she tried to evict me and instead lost everything, and I realize the lesson will echo far beyond this lake. Tyrants fall, truth endures, and when communities stand together against fear, no HOA Karen, no matter how loud, can ever truly win.